The Pacific War was fought not only on the open seas and dense jungles, but also in the silent impressions left on the minds of soldiers. Imagine a young Japanese infantryman, weary from weeks of hunger and sleepless nights, stepping onto an island base newly seized by American forces. Before him rises a scene that seems impossible. Stretching across the horizon are rows of sturdy wooden barracks, large kitchens puffing steam into the air, and warehouses overflowing with supplies. For men accustomed to scraping by on half rations of rice and dried fish, this world of abundance feels unreal. It is a moment that shakes not only the body, but the spirit, as the soldier realizes he is staring at a different kind of war. In training camps back home, Japanese recruits were told to expect little and to survive on less. The Imperial Army instilled in them the belief that strength came not from comfort, but from suffering and sacrifice. They were trained to endure long marches with minimal food, to sleep on hard ground, and to fight even when exhausted. Survival was not a matter of luxury, but of willpower. Yet here, in the heart of the Pacific, that philosophy collided with a starkly different reality. The Americans did not see hardship as a badge of honor. They saw it as a weakness to be avoided, and they built their war machine to ensure their men would never be left wanting. The first encounters with American camps were not battles, but revelations. Japanese soldiers who crept through abandoned U.S. positions after skirmishes found themselves surrounded by things they had never imagined. There were crates filled with canned meats and powdered milk, stacks of fresh uniforms, and even personal comforts like cigarettes and coffee. To them, it was as if the Americans lived in a world untouched by war, where the battlefield was only an extension of a prosperous home. The contrast was enough to spark disbelief, as if two armies were fighting the same war in completely different eras. This shock was not limited to material goods alone. It extended to the very scale of what the Americans had built. Their camps resembled small cities, complete with medical stations, kitchens capable of feeding thousands, and supply depots organized with precision. The Japanese were accustomed to temporary shelters and makeshift arrangements, often digging into the earth to form crude bunkers or huts. But the Americans constructed with a vision of permanence, as though they intended to stay for as long as needed. To the eyes of a weary Japanese soldier, it was like entering another world, one that reflected an entirely different philosophy of war. The emotional impact of these discoveries cannot be overstated. For men raised in an empire that preached the virtue of sacrifice, seeing such abundance was disorienting. It was more than just jealousy or wonder. It was the dawning realization that their enemy possessed resources so vast that no hardship could slow them down. Each camp stood as a monument to the industrial power of the United States, a power that dwarfed Japan's ability to supply its troops. The Japanese soldier might look upon a mountain of supplies and silently ask himself how spirit could ever match such strength. In these moments, war revealed itself not only as a clash of armies, but as a collision of worlds. The Japanese had entered the conflict believing that discipline and bravery could compensate for a lack of resources. They thought endurance was the measure of true strength. Yet the sight of American camps told a different story. It showed that in modern war, victory was built on factories, logistics, and the ability to provide. This early encounter with abundance was not just a passing impression. It was the first hint of the deeper imbalance that would shape the course of the Pacific War. The image of those camps lingered in the minds of Japanese soldiers long after they marched away. Even if they could not admit it openly, they carried with them the knowledge that their enemy fought under completely different conditions. It was like a shadow trailing behind every battle, a reminder of a strength that could not be matched through sacrifice alone. In this way, the story of the Pacific War begins not only with battles at sea or on land, but with the quiet shock of one army discovering the scale of another's world. That moment of realization set the stage for everything that would follow. The deeper Japanese soldiers moved into American-held territory, the more undeniable the contrast became. They were men conditioned to survive on less, to march on empty stomachs, and to sleep in damp holes carved from the earth. Their meals often consisted of a handful of rice or a few dried fish, a ration stretched thin and expected to sustain them through weeks of combat. Yet, when they stumbled upon American camps, they found kitchens stocked with enough food to feed entire battalions for months. Cans of meat, sacks of flour, and crates of coffee stood in neat rows, protected not by secrecy, but by the assumption that more would always arrive. For soldiers raised on scarcity, it was a world turned upside down. The accommodations told the same story. Japanese troops built shelters that were temporary by design, simple wooden frames or dugouts lined with palm leaves. They often slept shoulder to shoulder, exposed to the elements, with little more than a blanket to shield them from cold or rain. In contrast, American camps spread across the land like orderly villages. Wooden barracks stood firm, each one large enough to house dozens of men in relative comfort. Beds were raised from the ground, meals were hot, and even recreation was possible in certain bases. To the Japanese soldier, this was not a military camp at all, but a town transplanted into the jungle or onto a beachhead. The difference extended to the smallest details, and those details carried weight. While Japanese soldiers patched their uniforms again and again until they became threadbare, Americans received new clothing from endless supply depots. While Japanese rifles were sometimes passed from one man to another as casualties mounted, American troops seemed to have an endless stock of weapons, ammunition, and spare parts. Cigarettes, chocolate, even soap appeared in quantities that shocked men who had grown accustomed to doing without. Each small item became a reminder that the Americans were not only fighting with numbers, but with a level of comfort unimaginable to their opponents. This clash of realities did not remain on the surface. It cut deep into the psychology of those who witnessed it. Japanese troops had been taught that their nation's spiritual strength would carry them through. They were told that an iron will could overcome hunger and that dying with honor was preferable to living in excess. Yet standing inside an abandoned American camp surrounded by evidence of abundance, some could not escape the thought that spirit alone might not be enough. The contrast was no longer abstract. It was tangible, felt in the smell of freshly cooked food left behind, or in the sight of warehouses bursting with supplies. For some, this discovery was humiliating. They had been told that Americans were weak, unable to endure suffering, and too soft to face prolonged hardship. Yet the camp suggested something very different. It was not weakness that built these facilities, but strength and the foresight to prepare for the long war ahead. To Japanese soldiers who clung to the belief that sacrifice was a noble weapon, the scale of American abundance was a kind of quiet defeat. It did not come from the clash of swords or the fire of guns, but from the realization that the enemy fought on ground they could never reach. The shock of this contrast did not end when they left the camp. It lingered in their minds as they returned to their own dugouts, as they ate meager rations under the cover of night. Each time they compared their conditions with what they had seen, the gulf between the two worlds widened. This was not simply a matter of material wealth. It was a revelation of how differently two nations waged war. One believed victory could be forged in the furnace of endurance. The other trusted in the endless flow of supplies. The two visions collided in the Pacific, and in that collision, Japanese soldiers found themselves questioning the very foundations of their struggle. In this way, the camps became more than physical spaces. They became symbols. For Americans, they represented the strength of a nation that could reach across oceans and bring its industrial heart to the battlefield. For Japanese soldiers, they represented the painful truth that their sacrifices, however noble, were weighed against a force far greater than hunger or fatigue. This contrast was not merely striking, it was devastating, planting the seeds of doubt that would grow as the war dragged on. The abundance that so shocked Japanese soldiers did not come by accident. It was the product of decades of preparation, rooted in the immense industrial capacity of the United States. By the time the Pacific War erupted, American factories were already capable of producing at a scale unmatched anywhere in the world. Ships, aircraft, tanks, and weapons rolled off assembly lines in staggering numbers, but just as important was the infrastructure to feed, clothe, and house the millions of men who would fight overseas. The sprawling camps Japanese soldiers encountered were not improvised. They were the carefully designed result of a nation that understood modern war would be won as much with supply chains as with bullets. For the Americans, the philosophy of war was deeply practical. A soldier's fighting ability was directly tied to his condition. A hungry man could not march far, a sick man could not fight well, and a weary man could not endure the strain of battle. Therefore, the U.S. military invested heavily in logistics to ensure that every soldier was fed, housed, and cared for. The vast kitchens, medical stations, and barracks that so amazed the Japanese were simply extensions of this philosophy. They were not luxuries, but necessities designed to maintain fighting strength. This approach stood in sharp contrast to the Japanese system, where endurance was considered a virtue and deprivation a natural part of war. The Imperial Japanese Army had been shaped by a different set of traditions. Rooted in a culture that valued sacrifice, it emphasized spirit and discipline over material comfort. Soldiers were taught that strength came from suffering, that the ability to endure hunger and hardship would harden them for combat. Supplies were often stretched thin, not only because of Japan's limited resources, but because commanders believed scarcity would toughen their men. In this worldview, hardship itself was a weapon. But when measured against the scale of American abundance, that weapon began to look fragile and outdated. The origins of America's logistical power could also be traced to its geography and economy. With vast natural resources and an industrial base that had grown rapidly during the early 20th century, the United States possessed the means to sustain long and distant wars. When mobilization began, American industries did not simply arm their troops, they transformed the way war was supplied. Railways, shipping networks, and naval convoys were harnessed to move mountains of goods across oceans. Each camp in the Pacific was the final link in a chain that stretched from Midwestern farms to West Coast ports, and from shipyards to the front lines. For Japanese soldiers who saw only the end result, the scale of that system was nearly incomprehensible. This difference in origins reflected more than just economics. It reflected a worldview. Americans saw war as a test of organization and resources, where planning and efficiency could save lives and secure victory. Japanese leaders saw war as a test of spirit, where suffering and sacrifice proved a soldier's worth. These two philosophies collided in the Pacific, and in the camps where American soldiers lived, the difference was visible in every detail. For the Japanese, accustomed to equating deprivation with strength, the sight of abundance was more than surprising. It was a challenge to the very beliefs that had shaped their training and identity. Even the construction of the camps told a story about origins. The Americans built with permanence in mind, creating barracks and facilities that could withstand tropical weather and support large forces indefinitely. This reflected a nation confident in its ability to sustain itself far from home. Japanese positions, by contrast, were often temporary, carved into the landscape with the assumption that men would endure whatever conditions they faced. One approach prioritized longevity and efficiency. The other emphasized endurance and adaptability. But as the war dragged on, it became clear which model gave soldiers the better chance of survival. Thus, when Japanese troops looked upon American camps with shock, they were not only seeing material abundance, they were witnessing the outcome of two competing visions of war. One was born from scarcity and sacrifice, the other from industry and logistics. The origins of these differences stretched far back into economies, cultures, and philosophies that shaped each nation. And as the Japanese soldiers would discover, those origins would dictate not just the conditions of camp life, but the course of the entire conflict. On the battlefield, the difference between scarcity and abundance was not a distant idea. It was something that soldiers felt with every step they took and with every shot they fired. American troops arrived at the front lines with full stomachs, clean uniforms, and weapons that had been carefully maintained. Their confidence was reinforced by the knowledge that reinforcements and supplies would not run out. Even in the most remote islands of the Pacific, food convoys and cargo planes kept the flow of necessities steady. In contrast, Japanese soldiers often entered battle after days of hunger, their energy drained before the fighting even began. The imbalance was not abstract. It was written on the faces of the men who fought. Imagine a firefight in the thick jungle of Guadalcanal. The crack of rifles and the roar of artillery fill the air. American soldiers, well supplied, can fire freely, knowing that ammunition will be replenished. Their rifles are clean, their belts heavy with extra magazines. Meanwhile, Japanese soldiers fire sparingly, each shot chosen carefully because every bullet is precious. Some advance with bayonets fixed, not from tactical preference, but because their ammunition is nearly gone. Hunger gnaws at their stomachs as much as the fear of enemy fire. In this clash, the difference between abundance and deprivation becomes painfully clear. The ability of American camps to keep men rested and fed also meant that morale was consistently higher. A soldier who knows he will eat tonight, who knows he will receive medical attention if wounded, fights with a sense of reassurance. Japanese soldiers, on the other hand, fought with the constant shadow of deprivation. Illness spread quickly in their camps, exhaustion was constant, and rations grew thinner with each passing week. Their courage remained, but courage without strength became harder to sustain. On the battlefield, this translated into fatigue, slower movements, and the gradual erosion of effectiveness. The difference extended beyond individual soldiers to the scale of entire operations. American forces could launch extended offensives, secure beachheads, and hold territory because their camps functioned like supply engines. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies flowed continuously, allowing units to remain in action far longer than the Japanese could. When one unit grew weary, another could rotate in, fresh and fully supplied. Japanese forces rarely had this luxury. Their offensives were often brief bursts of ferocity, followed by periods of exhaustion and retreat when supply lines could not keep up. The camps, in effect, dictated the rhythm of the war. For Japanese soldiers who saw the aftermath of these battles, the difference was undeniable. They might retreat to their dugouts, nursing wounds and hunger, only to face American forces that seemed endlessly renewed. To them, the American soldier appeared almost machine-like, never truly worn down, always ready for another push. What they did not see was the machinery behind the scenes, the vast camps and logistics that made this possible. All they could witness was the result, an enemy who never seemed to tire. The shock of seeing American abundance in camp life became a grim reality on the battlefield, where that abundance turned into relentless pressure. The imbalance also influenced tactics. Japanese commanders urged their men to rely on surprise, speed, and spirit, launching night raids and banzai charges to offset the material gap. These tactics could cause shock and damage, but they were costly and unsustainable. The Americans, sustained by their camps, absorbed these blows and then counterattacked with overwhelming firepower and supplies. Each failed assault reminded Japanese soldiers that courage alone could not outlast a nation with seemingly limitless resources. The battlefield became the stage where philosophy met reality, and reality was merciless. Over time, the consequences of this disparity wore down even the most determined Japanese units. Hunger, exhaustion, and dwindling supplies hollowed their strength, while American forces maintained steady pressure. The battlefield impact of the American camp system was not measured only in victories, but in the erosion of their enemies' will. Japanese soldiers, no matter how brave, could not ignore what their bodies told them. Spirit could not march on an empty stomach. Sacrifice could not substitute for steady ammunition. In the Pacific War, the battlefield revealed that abundance was not simply comfort. It was power, and it shaped the outcome of every clash. The shock of encountering American camps did not remain confined to the moments when Japanese soldiers stumbled upon them. It began to ripple outward, shaping how men perceived the war itself. For a soldier raised to believe that endurance and sacrifice could bridge any gap, the reality of American abundance was a silent but crushing weight. Every glimpse of overflowing supply depots or vast barracks was a reminder that Japan was fighting an opponent sustained by forces far beyond the battlefield. The Americans were not simply well-fed men with good equipment. They were the embodiment of a nation's industrial power, and that realization carried a psychological cost. Morale within Japanese units was gradually affected by this realization. In the early stages of the war, men marched into battle with conviction, believing that their spirit would carry them to victory. But as the months wore on, and as the contrast with American camps became clearer, doubts crept in. Some soldiers quietly questioned whether sacrifice was enough, while others carried the burden silently, ashamed to admit what they had seen. For many, the sight of American abundance was not just impressive, it was demoralizing. It whispered that the fight ahead was not only against enemy soldiers, but against an entire system of supply and wealth that could not be undone by courage alone. Meanwhile, the Americans drew strength from their abundance, knowing that food, ammunition, and reinforcements were always within reach, gave U.S. soldiers a confidence that went beyond the battlefield. They fought with the reassurance that their nation stood firmly behind them, ready to sustain them for as long as the war demanded. This sense of security translated into resilience, allowing them to recover from setbacks and press forward with determination. For Japanese soldiers who observed this resilience, the contrast was painful. They carried the weight of scarcity into every battle, while their opponents carried the strength of certainty. The consequences reached beyond individual morale and touched the strategies of the two nations. Japan, struggling to supply its forces, was forced to rely on quick offensives, surprise attacks, and the belief that sheer determination could compensate for lack of material support. The United States, with its well-supplied camps and endless convoys, could afford to fight a long war. It could absorb losses, regroup, and strike again with full strength. The camps symbolized this difference in approach. They were not just shelters for soldiers, but the foundation of a strategy built on patience and persistence. For the Japanese, this imbalance created a kind of silent despair. Men who returned from encounters with American camps often carried with them stories of what they had seen. These stories spread through the ranks, sparking disbelief, frustration, and in some cases, quiet resignation. The thought that their enemy lived in comfort while they endured hunger and disease was a bitter truth. It reinforced the sense that the war was being fought on unequal terms, with one side drawing from a well that could never run dry. This disparity was as damaging as any bullet or bomb, eroding the will to fight, even among the most devoted. Over time, the wider consequences became visible in the outcome of campaigns. Battles were not lost only on the front lines, but in the inability to sustain forces over time. Japan's reliance on sacrifice could not fill empty stomachs or replace lost equipment. Each retreat, each failed offensive, was tied to the same root cause, the lack of resources. In contrast, every American advance was supported by the machinery of supply, turning their camps into engines of victory. For Japanese soldiers, the memory of these camps became part of the explanation for why their struggle grew harder with each passing month. The truth was clear. The war was not only a contest of armies, but a contest of systems. One system relied on spirit and sacrifice, the other on logistics and abundance. The wider consequences of that difference spread far beyond the camps themselves. They shaped morale, strategy, and ultimately, the trajectory of the Pacific War. For the Japanese soldier, the shock of encountering American abundance was not a fleeting moment. It was a revelation that the battlefield was tilted by forces too vast to be overcome, a realization that would haunt them as the war pressed on. As the Pacific War reached its later years, the difference between American abundance and Japanese scarcity could no longer be ignored. What had once been moments of shock inside an abandoned camp became an unshakable reality. Every new encounter reinforced the same truth. The Americans fought with the power of a nation that could build, feed, and supply on a scale unimaginable to Japan. For Japanese soldiers, the climax of this realization did not arrive in a single dramatic scene, but through the relentless repetition of evidence. The camps, the convoys, the seemingly endless supply of weapons and food, they became a constant reminder of a war Japan was struggling to sustain. On islands like Saipan, Leyte, and Iwo Jima, Japanese defenders experienced this imbalance in its most brutal form. As they clung to caves and tunnels, their rations dwindled to near nothing. Rice was stretched with weeds, water was scarce, and weapons grew old in their hands. Outside those caves, Americans advanced with steady firepower backed by camps that ensured their endurance. The Japanese soldiers who watched this advance could feel the weight of futility pressing down upon them. No matter how fiercely they resisted, the Americans always seemed capable of returning stronger, with more men, more weapons, and more supplies. Imagine being a soldier trapped in that environment. The night is filled with the sound of American artillery, the ground shaking with each explosion. Hunger gnaws at your body and thirst cracks your lips, while the enemy outside eats hot meals and drinks clean water. You grip your rifle tighter, but deep inside, a voice whispers that no amount of courage can bridge the gulf between you and your opponent. That voice is not treason, it is recognition. The camps you once saw with disbelief have now become symbols of inevitability. They are proof that the enemy fights with resources you will never match. The Japanese command urged men to fight to the last, to charge in suicidal attacks when supplies ran out. These moments of desperate bravery remain etched in history, but behind them lay the harsh truth that there was no other choice. A soldier who had seen American camps knew why his commanders ordered such measures. Without supplies, without reinforcements, there was no way to wage a prolonged defense. Spirit could light the fire of a single charge, but it could not feed an army for months. The climax of realization came when soldiers understood that their sacrifice was not equal to the resources arrayed against them. For the Americans, this difference was not a mystery. They understood the strength of their supply lines and leaned heavily on them. Every battle plan, every campaign, was built on the confidence that food, ammunition, and replacements would follow. Their camps grew larger, their depots more crowded, and their soldiers more certain that endurance was on their side. The sight that stunned Japanese soldiers was, for Americans, simply the expected face of war. The irony was clear. What the Japanese saw as shocking excess, the Americans saw as the bare minimum for victory. As the war dragged on, the camps became symbols not only of strength, but of inevitability. Japanese soldiers, once taught that the enemy was soft, began to see them differently. The abundance was no longer mistaken for weakness. It was recognized as power, cold and unstoppable. Each new defeat underscored that recognition. Each retreat confirmed it. The climax of their realization was not a single battle, but the dawning awareness that their empire was locked in a struggle it could not win. In the jungles, on beaches, and inside caves carved into volcanic rock, that truth became undeniable. The American camps loomed as silent participants in every battle, their presence felt even when unseen. They fed the soldiers who stormed ashore, they armed the men who pushed forward, and they cared for the wounded who returned. For Japanese soldiers, the final recognition was bitter. The war was not lost only in combat, but in the overwhelming abundance that their enemy carried with him. That abundance, embodied in every camp, was the climax of their disillusionment. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the memory of American camps lingered long after the smoke cleared. For many Japanese soldiers who survived, those vast facilities remained etched in their minds as vivid symbols of the war's imbalance. They recalled the rows of barracks, the overflowing warehouses, and the kitchens that never seemed to run dry. These were not simply images of comfort. They were reminders of the industrial power that had carried the United States across the Pacific. Even decades later, veterans would describe the shock of seeing such abundance, a shock that had cut deeper than bullets or shells. The legacy of that contrast extended beyond individual memory. It shaped how Japan came to understand the war itself. The empire had taught its soldiers that spirit, sacrifice, and discipline could overcome any obstacle. Yet the war revealed that in the modern age, courage was not enough. Factories, supply lines, and logistics were as decisive as battlefield bravery. For Japan, the realization was painful, but it became part of the national reflection in the years after defeat. The American camps were remembered not only as enemy strongholds, but as living proof of the gap between two worlds. In the United States, the story was remembered differently. For American soldiers, the camps were rarely seen as extraordinary. They were simply part of the machinery of war, designed to keep men strong and focused. Yet to their enemies, those same facilities had appeared almost otherworldly. This contrast in perception highlighted the vast difference between how each side understood the war. One side saw abundance as routine, the other saw it as overwhelming. The same kitchens, the same warehouses, carried two very different meanings depending on who stood inside them. The broader legacy was a lesson in what modern conflict required. The Pacific War demonstrated that bravery could inspire, but it could not sustain armies indefinitely. Nations needed the power to feed, arm, and support their soldiers across vast distances if they hoped to prevail. For Japan, this was a sobering truth, one that reshaped its post-war approach to industry and international power. For the United States, it confirmed that logistics and supply were not supporting roles, but central to victory. The camps that shocked Japanese soldiers thus became symbols of a new era of warfare. Even in memory, the shock remained. For Japanese veterans, recalling those camps was not a matter of shame alone, but of clarity. They had seen firsthand that their sacrifices were measured against an opponent whose strength lay in resources as much as in will. For American veterans, the camps were simply home away from home, places that kept them alive during the long march across the Pacific. Two nations, two perspectives, joined by the same physical spaces that told such different stories. In the end, the scale of the American camps was more than a wartime detail. It was part of the legacy of the Pacific War itself, a reminder that battles are won not only with weapons, but with the ability to sustain those who wield them. The shock felt by Japanese soldiers was the shock of a world colliding with a new kind of warfare, one built on abundance and efficiency. And as history looks back on that conflict, the image of those sprawling camps remains, standing as monuments to the industrial power that shaped the outcome of the war and the lessons that endured long after its end.